Hi, my name's Louisa Rose. I'm the Chief Winemaker at Yalumba. Yalumba is Australia's oldest family-owned winery based in the Barossa in South Australia. I want to tell you a little bit about a collection of wines we make called Samuel's Collection. But before I talk about the wines, I need to talk about Samuel, because Samuel Smith was the first of the family that still owns Yalumba today, who came out from Wareham in Dorset in the UK in the 1840s and established Yalumba in 1849. His descendants, 6 generations later now, still own and run Yalumba. And we who work here work in this beautiful generational historic site. Some of you might have even visited Yalumba and seen what a beautiful building and the grounds that we work in are. But the tradition is a really important part of the history of where we've come from. The other great thing about the family is because they've had a generational view, it's also got a very sort of long-term vision. And that vision evolves around making wines that are relevant and modern to today's society. And that's really appropriate for the Samuel's Collection wines. So I said we're in the Barossa, and these wines come from the Barossa region. There's 2 parts to the Barossa. There's the higher altitude Eden Valley, lower fertility soils, more shallow soils, but most importantly higher in altitude, up to about 1,500 feet. What happens when things get cooler, particularly at night time, is that the aromatics and the delicacy of varieties are preserved. And so some of our Samuel's Collection grapes and hence wines come from the Eden Valley. The other part of the Barossa is the Barossa Valley. Probably, the term, the region that you might have heard about more so perhaps even than the Eden Valley. But the Barossa Valley is lower in altitude, richer soils, although we have a beautiful tapestry of different types of soils, but richer soils, more fertile, and the wines take on a more sort of generous palate weight. Typically, we often blend those 2 regions together. So for example, when we get to the last wine, the Shiraz from the Samuel's Collection, it's going to have grapes from both the Eden Valley giving beautiful aromatics and perfume, and the Barossa Valley giving this beautiful richness into the palate. We're also going to have a look at just a Barossa Valley wine, which is our Grenache, which just comes from that warmer country down on the valley floor, and the Viognier, which comes from the cooler Eden Valley. So let's start off with the Viognier. So Yalumba in Australia is synonymous with Viognier. We were the pioneers of Viognier. We started working with it in 1980. That was when we first planted our vineyards. And that was one of the first vineyards to be planted outside of Condrieu in the Northern Rhone. I know in the US, in the early 80s, Viognier started to be planted as well. And we've been on a very similar journey here at Yalumba to many of the producers in the US. The Viognier in the Samuel's Collection, I often talk about being our essence of Viognier. If you open this and have a glass, there's everything in that glass that Yalumba think Viognier is all about. It's got those beautiful flavours of stone fruits, white peaches, apricots, a little bit of ginger spice, maybe some white pepper, but most importantly, it's got lovely flavour, and then it finishes quite refreshingly dry. Not because it's got high acid, Viognier is not a high acid variety, but because it has these beautiful fine white tannins that give length and freshness to the wine. And they also mean that the wine has some ageability. The second wine, the Samuel's Collection Grenache, this, as I said before, comes from the Barossa Valley. Grenache is absolutely at home here in the Barossa, along with Shiraz and other varieties like Mourvèdre, which we call Mataro. Grenache was planted very early on in the 1840s in the Barossa. And because phylloxera came to many other regions of the world, including Europe, we've never had phylloxera here in South Australia. We've got some of the oldest Grenache and Shiraz vines growing anywhere in the world. And that's an amazing legacy, particularly for a variety like Grenache. So the Samuel's Collection Bush Vine Grenache comes from old vines. On average, the vineyards are probably 70 years old in this wine. They are bush vines, as the name suggests, which means there's no trellising. And year after year, these vines just continue to produce these beautiful grapes that give us this medium-bodied style. So the Yalumba Grenache style, you won't see in big tannic varieties. These wines are medium-bodied, they're soft, they're plush, but don't think they're simple. There's so much texture going on the palate. They're so food friendly. They're just beautiful wines. The Viognier and the Grenache have a few things in common, and one of them is that we don't age either of these wines in any new oak. So the oak that these wines are aged in is all mature French oak that's had other varieties in them. The barrels are 5 to 10 years old. The oak, though, that we use is there to help the wines develop and to get that beautiful sort of richness and softness that you'll see on both of these wines. The other thing that these two wines have is that I think that they are, of all the varieties we make, our most food friendly. And in fact, I like throwing the challenge out to people to find, food matches for either of these wines that don't work. Both of them cross over the spectrum between the typical white wine, red wine foods. They both love spice. They both love Asian cuisines, Middle Eastern cuisines. They love, earthy flavours like mushrooms, and they're both absolutely at home with a beautiful fine steak. So if you're interested in experimenting with food and wine matching, these two wines are absolutely perfect for doing that with. The last wine in the collection, which is the Samuel's Collection Shiraz, as I mentioned before, comes from the Eden Valley and also the Barossa Valley. So we have varying fruit flavours and hence characteristics in the wine that come from those different regions. The other thing about this wine, which is the first wine of the three I'm showing you, it has some new oak in it. And that is a great story for us because we cooper our own oak here at Yalumba. We have a cooperage. It's literally behind the wall, behind me here, behind the wall and across the driveway. And our coopers make the barrels for these wines. We have to import French oak or American oak and Hungarian oak because there's no natural oak grown in Australia. But once the oak comes in here, we have the opportunity to cooper it, fire it, and craft the barrels absolutely perfectly for each wine that we use them for. So the Samuel's Collection wine, this vintage of 2018, has around 25% of new oak in it. And that's because the 18 vintage was a very rich vintage, and it could handle a little bit more new oak. Typically this wine's somewhere around the 15 to 20% new oak. And it ages for about 12 months in oak and then we release it. And the wine itself has that beautiful, the richness that you would expect from Barossa Shiraz, but not the heaviness that sometimes you might stereotypically think comes from the Barossa. These wines are really light on their feet. The Barossa Shiraz also has those beautiful perfumes out of the Eden Valley. It's a wine which is absolutely drinking beautifully now, but like all the Yalumba wines, if you pop them away for a couple of years and lose track of them, they'll still be equally delicious to drink with a little bit of bottle age on them.